Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Library. I'm John Shattuck, CEO of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and on behalf of myself and Deborah Leff, the library's director, we're delighted to have you here to this special forum on the crisis in Iraq. Tonight's forum is part of our five-part series commemorating the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis and what President Kennedy's management of that most dangerous moment in the last half-century should mean to the debate today about how to prevent weapons of mass destruction from being used. I want to thank the sponsors of this forum series, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, as well as our media partners, the Boston Globe, WBUR, Boston.com, who help us send this national town meeting into a truly national setting far beyond the walls of this library. 40 years ago this week, on October 22, 1962, President Kennedy addressed the nation in what historians agree was one of the most fateful presidential speeches ever delivered. Kennedy announced that night that the American people faced a grave threat from weapons of mass destruction secretly deployed by the Soviet Union 90 miles from our shores. He demanded that the Soviets remove these weapons or face grave consequences. His words were unambiguous. He said the urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these offensive weapons of mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all Americans and all the Americas, in flagrant and deliberate defiance of the Charter of the United Nations and my own public warnings to the Soviets. The background of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, was very simple. Nikita Khrushchev expected the United States to invade Cuba and drive Fidel Castro from office. Khrushchev thought he could deter the invasion while at the same time demonstrating to the world that the Soviets could compete with the United States in missile power. So he decided secretly to send offensive missiles to Cuba and then to call Kennedy's bluff when they were in place. Kennedy, of course, did not allow that to happen. But the means that he used to achieve that end were complex and subtle. And for that reason, his leadership speaks across the decades as Americans today confront another crisis under another president, on the brink of war over the threat of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. In superficial ways, the situations are similar, but in many ways they are very different, as I'm sure our panelists will bring out tonight. But regardless of the similarities and differences between Cuba in 1962 and Iraq today, there can be no question that President Kennedy's approach to the missile crisis is more relevant today than at any time in the last 40 years. The reason is very clear. Kennedy searched relentlessly for ways to achieve his objectives without war. Ultimately, he was successful because he dared to challenge the advice he was receiving and to keep all his options open for a peaceful resolution of the crisis. Kennedy's closest advisor, Ted Sorensen, put it this way in his biography of the president. He said, above all, Kennedy believed in retaining a choice, not a choice between red or dead or Holocaust or humiliation, but a variety of options in the event of aggression, an opportunity for time and maneuver in the instruments of diplomacy, and a balanced approach to every crisis which combined both defense and diplomacy. Tonight, as the UN Security Council begins its debate on Iraq, and President Bush presses his case for invasion if Saddam Hussein does not allow unfettered weapons inspections, we are here to discuss this latest crisis and its impact on the world, and in the spirit of President Kennedy's relentless quest for ways to avert war, the options that may exist for resolving the Iraq crisis without risking a broader confrontation. Our panel discussion tonight will be moderated by Kevin Cullen, who is sitting in the middle of this panel, a distinguished foreign correspondent for the Boston Globe who has received awards for his outstanding coverage of the conflict in Northern Ireland and was most recently the Globe's London bureau chief and European correspondent. Kevin is currently covering the global fallout from the September 11th attacks. Scott Ritter, who is sitting second to the right as the audience looks, is a former UN weapons inspector with an extensive background in issues involving the Middle East, the former Soviet Union, and Europe. As an intelligence officer for the United States Marine Corps, he earlier served as the lead analyst for the Marine Corps Rapid Deployment Force at the time of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Iran-Iraq War. Gillian Sorensen, who is sitting next to Scott Ritter, again to his left as the audience is looking, we are particularly honored to have her here today because today is United Nations Day. Gillian Sorensen is the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations for External Affairs, who works directly with Secretary General Kofi Annan, one of the Kennedy Library's 2002 Profile in Courage Award winners, I might add. Before taking her current position, Gillian served as Special Advisor for Public Policy to Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali, and this fall she and her husband, Ted Sorensen, are fellows at Harvard's Institute of Politics. Mickey Edwards, who is sitting second to the left as you look at the panel, served for 16 years as a member of Congress from Oklahoma. He rose to be fourth-ranking Republican in the House of Representatives and was chair of the House Republican Policy Committee. He is now the John Quincy Adams Lecturer in Legislative Politics at the Kennedy School of Government, writes a syndicated newspaper column, and appears as a regular political commentator on National Public Radio. Stephen Van Evera, on your far right, is a professor of international relations at MIT with a special interest in the causes and prevention of war, U.S. foreign policy, and U.S. national security policy. His most recent book is Causes of War, Power and the Roots of Conflict, and he has written extensively on nationalism, the causes of World War I, American defense policy, and American intervention. And finally, Ravi Drucker, who is sitting right here next to me, is diplomatic correspondent for the Israeli Defense Force Broadcast Service in Tel Aviv. He is currently a fellow at the Nieman Foundation at Harvard, where he is exploring international conflict, conflict negotiation, and the impact of news coverage on conflict resolution efforts. Please join me then in welcoming this very distinguished panel to discuss this crisis.
Thanks, John. I think it would be helpful for the audience if we do two quick questions here on the panel. Who thinks the case has been made to go to war with Iraq? Show of hands. All right. Who on this panel thinks that it is inevitable that before the winter is out, when apparently militarily it's the time that has to be done, who believes that there will be a war with Iraq?
Probable.
What's that, Steve?
Probable, not inevitable.
Probably. Well, with that unsuccessful poll completed, I want to start with you, Scott. You've been there more recently, I guess, than any of us. You don't believe that the administration has made a case to go to war with Iraq, and yet I don't expect that you think that Saddam Hussein is the most stable person we should have leading a government.
No, I agree 100%. The case for war hasn't been made. I reflect on this as a former Marine who has worn the uniform to defend my country. I took an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And to me, the case for war revolves around dealing with a threat to the national existence of the United States, our national security. And while I view Saddam Hussein as a brutal dictator and a menace to his own people and a potential threat to the region, I don't view him or his government as a threat to the United States worthy of war, worthy of the sacrifice of a single American life.
But Steve, I guess, going on to Steve, there's human rights activists who were among the loudest voices calling for essentially regime change in Yugoslavia to get rid of Milosevic, a guy that had waged wars and created all sorts of problems. wouldn't consistency argue that regime change is a human rights issue, and that Saddam Hussein has violated the human rights of his own people? He has gassed the Kurds. He has made a mockery of democratic politics within Iraq. Doesn't that human rights claim argue that we should take this guy out?
I think there's two serious arguments for the war, and when you say, has the case for the war been made, I don't think the administration has made a very good case, but I think there are others who've made a good case. I highly recommend to everyone here interested in this war that you take a look at a book recently published by Kenneth Pollock called, what's it called? Pardon?
Gathering Storm.
Gathering Storm. It's a really outstanding advocacy of war, very judicious, very learned, very knowledgeable. There was nothing of this quality published before the first Gulf War, or the Vietnam War for that matter, assessing things from both sides. And even people who come to the debate saying, hey, you know, this war can't be a good idea, will learn a lot from the book because it's a very judicious look. And I think Pollock does make quite a good case for war. His case is mainly a national security case. He argues that Saddam is a guy in the end that we can't deter. And it has very much to do with Saddam's particular weirdness, his personality, the fact that he's a reckless risk taker, a guy who shoots the messenger within his own government, that when anyone brings him bad news, it ends badly for the messenger. As a result, if he's undertaking something that's not going to turn out well, you know, he's the last guy to know it. So if he starts trouble in the neighborhood that's not going to do well for Iraq, he won't know it, and he's very, you know, Pollock makes a very chilling case, which I'm not fully persuaded by myself, but a very serious case that in the end this is a special problem, that Iraq is much harder to deter than the ordinary country. The second serious case for the war, I think, is one that, especially in the Boston area, we've heard from Congressman Mickey, who is the Brandeis professor, former Iraqi citizen and dissident, who says, listen, the human rights case on the war with Iraq really lies with the Hawks, because Saddam is a terrible human rights abuser. He's murdered roughly 400,000 people during his reign in Iraq, which is an awful lot of killing in a country of only 20 million. And in the end, war itself will kill far fewer than Saddam will kill. If you measure the metric against the past wars, roughly 20,000 Iraqi troops and around 1,000 to 5,000 civilians were killed in the war. What about human rights? And I think that's a strong argument. I myself, again, I've said I'm not persuaded because I think other considerations outweigh. But I think the case for war is a serious case. This is not, this isn't an issue where you don't have serious arguments on both sides.
Raviv, you didn't put your hand up during my pathetic poll, but I get the sense that most Israelis have no problem with Saddam Hussein being taken out, and yet the first missile that's fired by British or American airplanes at Baghdad is probably more likely that bombs would be hurled back at Israel.
Yeah, I think most Israelis are aware of this fact, but if I try to think about the average Israeli guy, he thinks, well, if Saddam Hussein will gain nuclear weapon in 2, 3, 4 years, then the danger to Israel is far worse than the danger to hit by a couple of Scud missiles. And the fact that Prime Minister Sharon announced all the world that in case that there will be Israeli casualties, Israel will retaliate, not as what happened during the Gulf War, and the fact that there is no coalition to wound. I mean, if Israel retaliate right now, it's not like in the Gulf War where President Bush, Senior Bush, said, well, you will damage the whole war effort because there is a coalition. Now there is no coalition, so Israel could retaliate. So Israel is in danger of getting hurt, but still, from our point of view, from the Israeli administration point of view, better that American will fight Saddam than Israel will have to face him in a couple of years' time.
Gillian, a couple months ago, the president more or less said to the UN, put up or shut up. Get your resolutions followed, or we will unilaterally take action if we have to. Yet, in that time, the UN has worked its way and seems to have brought the administration, if anything, it's changed its rhetoric, it's less hawkish. It talks about, the president uses the UN in his speeches recently. Do you think the president was serious about that, or has been surprised by the reaction of allies such as France, such as countries that are on the Security Council and have really put a brakes on the push to war?
Well, it's exactly that kind of statement. made as a command, take it or leave it in a sense, that has created enormous resentment toward the United States among many other countries, including some of our best friends and allies. Most of them see going to war with Iraq as an enormous risk, with all kinds of consequences, including the unintended consequences. And they are prepared, they are trying to take all other possible steps before that to make sure that the possibilities of regime change without war may be tried, or the possibilities of removal of the weapons can be confirmed. In my view, that's not been confirmed, and the case of the President Bush, is not yet persuasive. There are a lot of steps between here and there. John Shattuck made reference to the Cuban Missile Crisis and to the fact, this is in my mind because I've heard about 10 discussions of this in the last few weeks, that the major difference is that President Kennedy's ultimate goal was to make peace. And I have the disturbing sense that George Bush's ultimate goal is to make war no matter what. And I think we should all be very cautious about that.
Mickey teaches a wonderful course at the Kennedy School called Understanding Conservatism. So I'm going to ask, isn't it? Or is it conservatism? I don't know. Something like that. Anyway, I was hoping you could help us understand George W. Bush a little more in this. Some pop psychologists are suggesting that the beginning of this, the genesis of this, is finishing a war that his father didn't finish. Do you buy that?
Well, they sound like academics to me. Well, you know, I think it's necessary to put this in some other perspectives. First of all, war is not something you engage in only when it is a question of national survival. One of the things that, you know, having been in public office, one of the things that I was aware of was the oath of office that I took when I was sworn in, and that requires a defense of the people of the United States. And I'm not saying whether, Bush has convincingly made the case, but I think that if you're a member of the government, and you do perceive a real threat to the lives of the American citizens, it is probably an impeachable offense for nonfeasance not to act. I think so. So the question is whether or not, in fact, the threat is real. If the threat is real, I don't think the president has an obligation to sit by and let it fester. I think that in terms of whether the case is made, I'm not sure. I mean, not what I certainly haven't read in the Globe or the New York Times or other places, something that convincingly makes the case. On the other hand, when people say the president should make the case to the people, well, the people he makes the case to are our representatives in Congress. You don't do it, on CNN, for the whole world to look at everything we've got. And, I'm a Republican, and I may be inclined not to always agree with people like Dick Gephardt and others, but when so many Democratic members of Congress who have seen what information the White House have decided that, yes, they ought to authorize the use of force, I don't think that should be brushed aside or taken lightly. I know Dick Gephardt very well. I don't always agree with him, but he is not somebody who would say, let's use military force because if we authorize that, it helps our election chances in November. That's just not what happens. So I think there is probably more of an argument to be made that at least in talking to the members of Congress, the president has laid out some pretty convincing signs that there is a danger that must be dealt with.
But how do members of Congress vet that information? I mean, how do you know how accurate that information is if, in fact, it's not shown in a public light and there's not scrutiny applied to it?
Oh, gee, I have a hard time thinking of any major conflict or potential conflict, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which all members of Congress were given all of the information that was available. There was finally the oversight photos that were released to the United Nations and that made the persuasive case. But members of Congress have enormous amounts of information that they have access to that they don't go back and talk to their constituents about.
But you don't buy the theory by some that this was an election. This was about the midterm elections to talk about war, keep the economy off the agenda.
That is such a cynical view that casts such an aspersion on all the members of Congress that I think that really is silly.
Scott, I know you don't believe the administration has made the case, but you've had a lot of experience over there. If you, in fact, were the point person for the administration, what would you have had to see for you to go out there and say, Mr. President, I think we need to go to war?
Well, I would need to see something that, A, determines that Iraq is developing capabilities that threaten the American people, and B, that there is no way to deter these capabilities if developed by Iraq, C, that we've exhausted all possible venues short of war to resolve this situation, and D, war is the only way to ultimately deal with this threat. You can't deal with the last three until you define that threat. I need to know that Iraq is developing weapons of mass destruction capability, plain and simple. That's the cornerstone. Now, we don't have that information. You can say the president might hold on to that data, but you talk to the people in the Senate Select Intelligence Committee, they haven't seen that data either.
But Mickey points out that our elected representatives have seen it, and they have voted democratically.
I would disagree. Well, they voted democratically. Have they seen it? What have they seen? It's a little disturbing when I hear people on the Senate Select Intelligence Committee say what the president's saying to the American people is not reflective of what we've seen, that there's more information out there that the American people need to see to put what the president is saying in proper perspective, that the president is vastly exaggerating the nature of the threat based upon the full intelligence. See, most people think that the full intelligence would somehow give you a broader picture of the threat, when the reality coming from the Senate Select Intelligence Committee and those elected representatives who have seen the data is that the full intelligence actually marginalizes the case the president is making. We need access to the full intelligence to our elected representatives so they can make a vote. Unfortunately, the vote made by our elected representatives for war was not made based upon all the data required to make that. They have not seen a compelling case for war. I believe that there is a heavy dose of politics at work here.
How realistic is that, Mickey, to see that stuff?
Well, I guess I would put it this way. There are some members of the Massachusetts delegation who voted for the resolution, and if you really believe it's all because it's for electoral advantage, then everybody in here ought to be working for their defeat.
Scott, I'm sorry, Scott. Steve, I think I don't want to summarize your own position. You could do it better than me, but I think you've argued that the war is not necessarily against Iraq. It should be against Al Qaeda. Under that reasoning, we know Iraq may or may not have weapons that could be turned against the United States and its interests. That may or may not be true. We do know that on September 11th in 2001, 15 of the 19 men that hijacked those planes were from a society that is one of the most repressive regimes on earth, where women are not allowed to drive cars, in which the government subsidized the sort of Islamic fundamentalism that recruits for organizations like Al Qaeda. I'm speaking of Saudi Arabia. Under that reasoning, isn't there a better case to launch a war against our allies, Saudi Arabia?
Well, opponents of the war on Iraq have pointed out there's a number of troubled states in the region and outside on which you can make an argument that they're more of a problem. Take North Korea, for example. North Korea's weapons of mass destruction program is more advanced than Iraq's, and North Korea also has a much longer and darker record of selling nasty military equipment around the world than Iraq does. Or if you look at Pakistan, Pakistan's a very ominous situation. Their regime is friendly to us right now, but they're teetering on the edge of imploding or being ousted, and their armed forces are shot through with the Islamic extremists, and they have nuclear weapons right now. One disaster scenario is that that regime will implode, and al-Qaeda's buddies will have immediate access to nuclear weapons. Then you got Saudi Arabia, which is, I agree with you, the heartbeat or the energy source for Islamic extremism in the Middle East. It's been exporting a very hostile, nasty version of Islam, Wahhabism, which is the dominant Islamic current in Saudi Arabia, throughout the region, setting up madrasas and religious schools in Pakistan and elsewhere, which have fueled the kind of extremism that gave rise to al-Qaeda and to the Taliban. So we've got a range of troubles that we need to deal with. And you're right. My first question I ask about this war is Iraq the top problem we face in the world? We have to set priorities and focus on the most serious. And to me, by far the most serious problem we face right now is al-Qaeda. They are by far the most serious threat to our country. And they are a very serious threat. I hate to speak bad news, but their aims are practically unlimited. I think they would love to commit more or less as much mayhem and killing in this country as they could. And at this point, we've only rolled up around a third of their leadership. 2/3 of their leaders are still on the lam, running loose, planning havoc. Roughly 90% of their jihadists are on the loose. They're definitely on their back on their heels. We've got them on the run. The ouster of the Taliban was a very positive step, but we do not have our arms around these guys yet. We still have a very terrifying situation in Russia, where there's a great deal of nuclear materials, biological materials, and scientists who know how to make nuclear and biological materials who are very poorly secured. And for a decade, our government, all three, Bush, Clinton, and Bush, have, in my opinion, terribly neglected the need to lock those materials down. I think it should be treated as a national emergency, that we should be going into Russia and locking these materials down. And it mystifies me why our government hasn't treated this as an emergency. We're only spending $1 billion a year to lock down an arsenal that is big enough to make tens of thousands of Hiroshima-sized bombs. And if you knew how these things were secured, you wouldn't sleep at night. You wouldn't sleep at night. So when I look at the danger that terrorists are going to get hold of weapons of mass destruction and use them on this country, by far the more likely scenario is that they're going to go get them from Russia, not from Iraq. And I'm worried about Iraq, but I want to deal with first things first. And we are not dealing with al-Qaeda yet. We must deal with the al-Qaeda threat and all the threats that give rise to it.
But Julian, can America deal with al-Qaeda on its own if it has to, and if not, can the UN? I mean, the UN's career in peacekeeping is checkered at best. When it comes to using force, it doesn't have the greatest record. Can the UN really lead the battle against terrorism, whether it's in Iraq or whether it's against al-Qaeda? Because clearly President Bush seems to be suggesting if the UN will not lead, America will.
Well, first of all, the U.S. certainly can't do away with terrorism all by itself. That's one of those global issues that crosses all borders without passports. And if we don't join with other nations in addressing the realities of terrorism, we're lost. We have no chance to do that alone. That's where the United Nations can be the forum for addressing it in political, military, financial, and other ways. But I'd like to go back to the notion of going after Saddam Hussein with a preemptive strike. That really chills me right to the core. If we start down that road, if we have publicized assassinations of heads of state, well announced long in advance, where does that lead us? There's a lot we can do between now and going to war. And one of those is to give full support for the weapons inspectors, to give them the time, it might be 2 months or 3 months, to do the job. Scott has more to say about this, but I believe they can, and verify whether or not those weapons of mass destruction are still there. If that answer doesn't come, then war is an option, but it should be the last resort. Certainly not the first resort. Now, yesterday I noticed, perhaps I'd missed it before, but I noticed something that Bush said that it seemed to me it was the first time. He said it is possible that regime change will refer to the removal of weapons, but not necessarily the removal of Saddam Hussein. I hadn't heard that before. Does that mean perhaps he's stepping back a little and allowing or hoping that the United Nations will come together, will support the effort to send and have the full weapons inspection, unfettered inspections, as they always say, and perhaps leave Saddam in office? That's one possibility. To me, the real concern are what I referred to before as the unintended consequences. Will a war leave the region more stable or less stable? Will it advance U.S. interests, or will it make the United States the target of the entire Muslim world from Tunisia to Indonesia? What will the follow-up be in terms of a governing body? Who is there in the opposition that is able and ready to move forward and to take on responsibility? Those are serious questions, and I don't hear the answers to that in the discussions going on right now.
Mickey, isn't there a more fundamental problem about our foreign policy is that we pick and choose people, we ignore the Saudis when they do terrible things, but when our enemies do it, we harp on it. We talk about Saddam being a madman. Well, he wasn't a madman when we was lined up against Khomeini, because that said isn't there a more fundamental problem with our foreign policy that our friends are our friends in the 80s and they're our enemies in the 90s?
Sure, that's a fundamental problem. It's a fundamental problem that we have, the Brits have, the French have, the Russians have, and everybody else has. And that is that you make your alliances according to what your interests are, what your national well-being requires at the time. And I think there's no question that some of the problems we have in the Middle East and elsewhere are a result of some of the alliances that we've built in the past because we thought it was necessary, either in terms of the Cold War or other times when we found ourselves supporting the Batistas or the Shah or varieties of other people who you really wouldn't want to take home to dinner. And it does come back and it haunts you. It's not unique to the United States, but it is certainly something where sometimes you pay the price for these alliances that you build. Realpolitik has a price, and sometimes it comes back to haunt you.
Ravi, we talked a little earlier, but I was hoping you could tell the audience a little more about Israeli public opinion, which is obviously around the world much stronger in terms of Saddam Hussein is a threat. And you talked about Saddam Hussein paying the families of suicide bombers. Explain that.
Yeah, maybe some of you know that the Iraqi government, Saddam Hussein, pays every suicide bomber family $25,000 after he commits suicide. So, of course, from the eyes of the point of view of the Israeli public, Saddam Hussein is maybe our worst enemy. And let me tell you a little bit about the mood in Israel in general. The mood in Israel is we wait for the war. I mean, everybody, the political system, Prime Minister Sharon, everybody waits for the war because the general notion is that the war will eventually change all the Middle East, and maybe it will create a better environment for Israel for the conflict with the Palestinians. But I must tell you one more thing, and I refer to what Scott said, that I'm amazed to hear what you said, because I heard you in the past, and from my memory, you said completely different things about Iraq, about Saddam Hussein planning, about his intention, and I don't think you have a different opinion than me about what Saddam Hussein did in the last 4 years. So I'm not saying that the United States should go to war tomorrow, but the fact that you're saying we don't have the data right now, well, sometimes states doesn't have the data. I mean, I don't think that Roosevelt had the data on 1939, what exactly Hitler was planning. But I think that any one of us would agree right now that maybe it would be a better thing to do to go preempting against Germany back then. And I could think about thousands of examples like this. So, I mean, I cannot argue with people who said the United States should not go to war unilaterally or we should exhaust the process or something like this. But to argue that Saddam Hussein doesn't have something or we don't know about something, so he probably doesn't have it, or we cannot do anything because we don't know, it sounds to me not so reasonable.
What about it, Scott?
Well, gosh, I spent 4 years in Israel, from 1994 to 1998 as the lead intelligence liaison with the Director of Military Intelligence. 1996, 1998, the individual I worked with was Moshe Ya'alon. I would presume you would share my assessment of him as being rather hawkish. Tough guy, not a wimp.
This is not what he said about himself, but okay.
Okay, but I have a little bit of respect for General Ya'alon. He's a guy who takes the defense of Israel seriously. Now, one of the reasons why I went to Israel and worked very hard for 4 years is that it was a two-way street in order for us to give Iraq a clean bill of health on weaponry. And that's, of course, the goal of an inspection, isn't it? To disarm Iraq, to go forward and do the job. And that's what we're trying to do. We're having trouble doing it because we couldn't get all the information we needed. Israel had a hell of a lot of information. We needed it. I went there and I got it. We exhausted Israel's databanks. When I arrived in 1994, General Sagay, who was at that time the DMI, told me that Iraq was Israel's number one threat. Number one threat. And one of the reasons is Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. When I left in 1998, Moshe Ya'alon said Iraq was number 6 and falling. And the reason was that Israel understood to what extent the weapons inspectors had disarmed Iraq. Israel understood that the inspection process worked. Israel understood that while we could not account for everything, we could definitely say that there was no gathering storm waiting to annihilate Israel. And it's been 4 years. We don't know what's gone on inside there for certainty. But I'll tell you this, my knowledge of Israel's intelligence capability combined with my knowledge of America's intelligence capability leads me to believe that Moshe Ya'alon would be losing sleep at night if Israel's intelligence was saying that there's a threat to Israel worthy of war. And yet I hear Moshe Ya'alon speak to the Israeli press. He says he's not losing any sleep at night over Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. And for God's sake, if he's not losing any sleep, then why the heck are we talking about going to war?
I'm saying in 1990, the same capabilities of the American intelligence and the Israeli intelligence will exist, but still none of this intelligence knew what Saddam Hussein has back then. And I would like to remind the audience that it's the same Moshe Ya'alon, who is now the Chief of Staff of Israel, saying that Iraq might have unconventional weapon and might have the ability to launch missiles against Israel, Saudi, maybe other states in the region. So it's not like he is sleeping very well at night. I'm just amazed that we're focusing on the sleep of Moshe Ya'alon. We might tell him this, but the ability of Saddam Hussein, it's not something that we really doubt. Maybe.
But I agree. Iraq might have weapons of mass destruction. They might have missiles to launch. Wouldn't it be nice to get weapons inspectors in there to find out? Because I'll tell you what, I'd rather put 200 weapons inspectors in Iraq looking for their weapons of mass destruction than 30,000 Marines. At the end of the day, those weapons inspectors come home. The 30,000 Marines, a lot of them won't come home, and if they do, they'll come home in a body bag. Let's do the weapons inspection thing before we rush off to war.
Steve, let me ask you, clearly, I think most people agree they would rather there not be a war. But, the reality is this guy's there. If not the United States, somebody's going to deal with him. What could you do? Could you really buy off a guy like Saddam Hussein without violence? Could you really entice him, lift sanctions, do something to help the country? Do you believe that there's something outside of war that can be done to bring Saddam Hussein back into the community of nations, if that's not a cliche?
I don't think we can reach some kind of accord or modus vivendi with him. The question is, can we contain him, meaning make it hard for him to develop weapons of mass destruction, so hard he doesn't do it, can't do it, or if we fail at that, can we deter him? And part of the serious case for war is that containment, it is true, is in fact breaking down. We had quite a tight economic cordon around Iraq up until around 3-4 years ago, and it really has been falling apart. Iraq is engaging more and more trade with other countries. As a result, they've got more and more access to the money they need to do bad things. And their total trade has really shot way up, and it's because Iraq's neighbors and the French and the Russians and others have increasingly not taken the sanctions regime seriously. I don't believe that the embargo on special military materials is broken down. In other words, the things that Iraq needs to build nuclear weapons, I am not convinced they are getting any of them. And I think the British, in fact, in their assessment of the situation that Tony Blair issued in September, their judgment was that Saddam is seeking nuclear weapons, but that the embargo on the special nuclear equipment, or let's just say that the things he needs to make the weapons, is still holding. And if it continues to hold, he will never get weapons, okay? In other words, there's hope here that we can maintain that tight embargo on the equipment he needs to make nuclear weapons. And if we do hold it, the British assessment was he will never get the weapons. But we do have to deal with the fact that he's gaining more and more economic resources. My feeling is that the reason why these sanctions are breaking down is because there's been a lack of leadership. The Clinton administration was diverted from leading the world to understand that it had an obligation to maintain a tight embargo on Iraq. And Pollock, for example, argues that the sanctions and the whole containment regime can't be resurrected. But when I look at the sweep of history for the last 50 years, we've seen a lot of containment work. And we've seen that when we want to draw a tight cordon around somebody, we managed to do it. With the Soviet Union, we had a very successful isolation policy that lasted many, many years. And the difference between that one and Iraq, to me, is that we had a very high level of presidential attention to it. So this is a key question. Can containment work? And I think the hawkish case, which is a sensible one, is no, it won't. Then there's the deterrence question. If he gets the weapons, can we deter him? And we've deterred a lot of real bad players throughout the Cold War. And I think the dovish case against this war is, gee, Saddam looks a lot like really bad people, like Stalin, like Mao, like Kim Il-sung. And we made deterrence work against them. And can we make deterrence work here, even though we're dealing with an odious regime, and even if it gains terrible weapons? Now, again, I think that Saddam does pose special problems, because the way he deals with subordinates is so peculiar, because he's got such a record of miscalculation and recklessness. And if we are going to deter him, we are going to have to understand it's going to take special effort. We're going to have to watch him like a hawk. We're going to have to develop special channels of communicating with him. We're going to have to have our buddies like Mubarak and Abdullah and Jordan, go there every month or two and pound the table and look him in the eye and explain the realities to him, because this is a man who's very hard to deter.
Hey, Kevin, I think it's important to have the discussion be based on what the contemporary situation is. And some of what I've heard suggests that what we should be advocating is inspections, not sending in 30,000 Marines to come home in body bags. That's not actually what's on the table. What's on the table is that everybody is agreed in the administration, probably in this room, that inspections are preferable, that inspections are what are wanted. And what's on the table is, what are the consequences that would flow if the inspection regime fails to uncover and remove the weapons? What are the consequences that should flow, and what triggers that reaction when you have determined that the UN resolutions are not being kept and cannot be kept? So, I mean, we're not talking about do we go in with war or do we inspect. Nobody is saying that. It's a matter of when we do the inspections, when we try to enforce the UN resolutions, if we are not successful in doing that, then what are the consequences and when do they start? That's what the current state of play is.
Then why did we have a war powers resolution voted on before we put inspectors in Iraq? Why is Paul Wolfowitz saying that war may be inevitable because we have a window of opportunity that opens in December and closes in March, and we don't want to give the inspections a chance to close that window? It seems to me that a decision for war has been made, and we're fooling ourselves if we think otherwise.
Well, I think you're inclined to think that, but if you look at what the Congress did not declare war. Under the Constitution, the Congress could declare war. In fact, I might parenthetically point out one of the big problems in what has just transpired that very few people pointed out. The only thing that the Bush has done so far that really bothered me was when he made the statement that he would take under advisement the opinions of others, but then he would decide, and there's nothing in the Constitution that gives the president the power to decide whether to go to war. Congress does that. But what Congress did was not to declare war. but to give the president the authority if he should decide that these other things don't work. So that's not what Congress did. That's a distinction. And believe it or not, even though your view of members of Congress may not be high, most can read and write and do understand the difference between what they did and what they could have done.
But Mickey, the president has said if the UN won't act, America will. Can America really go this alone? We're assuming the British will be there, but
we wouldn't.
Alone?
The United States would not be doing it alone. But a good part of the world would not be supportive of the United States. Obviously, the situation, if the United States had to do this, and I think everybody in this room and outside this room hopes that doesn't ever happen, hopes that war can be avoided. Just as I might point out in terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was not avoided because President Kennedy backed off, but because Khrushchev did when Kennedy made it clear that there would be consequences if Khrushchev did not. I think what the situation here would be that if the President of the United States decides and the Congress decides that we have to do this and there's no other way other than acting alone, then I think they have an obligation to do it. Every one of the countries that is critical of us for, quote, acting alone, again, the French, the Russians, whatever, if they perceived a threat to their own existence or their own sovereignty or their own welfare, would in fact act alone, and they have a long history of doing that. So, obviously, multilateralism is better than unilateralism, but that doesn't take away the obligation of a nation and a nation's leaders to act in the interest and survival and security of that nation.
Gillian, what are the consequences?
Well, I think it's very rash to say we can go it alone. I think those consequences could be disastrous. If the weapons inspectors go in and find that we are not in compliance, then the members of the Security Council have reason to come together as an international coalition to support a war. And they would then share the risk, the burden, the cost, the responsibility, the losses. But if we do that alone, not only are we doing it outside the legitimacy that the UN would give them, but we bear all of those costs, including the bodies that come home dead. Can you imagine soldiers from Boston on the streets of Baghdad? That's what it would be. And it's not going to be a war that can be won quickly or just won from 30,000 feet up. So I think we have to take the time to allow the inspections to happen, to see what those results are, and to do our best with some respect for the sovereign rights and the national interests of other nations to build that coalition, and not to order them around with that tone of arrogance and command that makes everyone seem as if they're nothing but mice on the floor. It's that really disturbs me. I'm in the UN every day. I see how it grates on people that the superpower acts as if it can do anything, anywhere, anytime. One other thought that I would add is that I think we can do much more with the neighbors in the region to see whether they are with us. This will affect them enormously, the destabilization of the region. Have we talked with them? Have we worked with them thoroughly? Are they with us? If that is the case, then we're in a much stronger position as well, and I don't think we're there yet.
Scott, you talked about body bags, people coming home in body bags, but I remember, particularly from the European left, people saying that if the Americans went after Afghanistan, it was going to be just like the Russians, they'd never get out of there, that bodies would be coming home in body bags, and that didn't happen. And in fact, the Taliban crumbled pretty quickly. Isn't there an argument to be made that once, American Marines start walking around Baghdad, maybe he falls from within?
Well, you can make that argument, but first of all, I would have a little bit of a dispute with those who say that didn't happen. Americans have come home in body bags.
Sure.
We're still there. Taliban didn't crumble. The Taliban simply took off their official Taliban government hats and put on their Pashtun tribal hats and went back to their villages, and they're still there. You think we've de-Talibanized Afghanistan? Go to the streets of Jalalabad, go to Herat, go to Kandahar, and tell me if the women are wearing burqas. and if the women are still being treated as third-class citizens. Tell them what we've done for the women of Afghanistan outside of Kabul. Give me the life expectancy of Hamid Karzai once the International Security Assistance Force withdraws from Afghanistan. No, we haven't done a damn thing for Afghanistan except make it even worse. We now have competing warlords. We've created an environment that not only has destabilized Afghanistan. Look, they're growing drugs right now, sponsored by the CIA, because that's the only cash crop they got. The bottom line is we haven't made things better in Afghanistan. We haven't even won the war against terror. Al-Qaeda's still there. We have the director of the CIA telling the American public that it's even more of a threat today than it was when we went. You know, what have we done in Afghanistan? Not a damn thing except make it worse. And now we're going to go to Iraq with this unfinished business already there, with this looming threat waiting to strike us, as the director of the CIA said. And what are we going to accomplish in Iraq? Regime removal? And replace it with what? At what cost? What allies?
That there was a failure, that Afghanistan was not a success as it's been measured.
I've had students from Afghanistan who I think, you know, women, they probably don't see it quite the same way Scott sees it. There are women who are still choosing to wear burqas. You know, it hasn't been a complete victory. It hasn't been a complete defeat, but I mean, it's certainly different. And it may be, it's kind of hard to sit here as an American male and say that things aren't better in Afghanistan, but I can tell you that there are a number of Afghan women I know who think it's better.
Well, on that point, I think we're going to open things up to questions. And first of all, I want to make clear that these are going to be questions, and hopefully directed at individual members of the. We got two microphones here, and we don't want statements. We do want questions, and there's two microphones here, so I'd ask that you get up and go to the mic and fire away. You're first, ma'am, because you're quick.
Good, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming, Scott, and to tell you that I'm speaking actually as a member of the press, but as an American citizen. And I wanted to just tell you how much you've affected me over the last 4 weeks, and how much you've been able to do for me to see my responsibility as an American citizen to become more informed about my country's foreign policy, and to take responsibility for that, really. So I wanted to begin by thanking you, especially, for coming tonight. And then I guess I'd like to share with you what I've been able to do as an individual American citizen.
Ma'am, I'm sorry.
Okay,
I'm sorry. I don't think you listened to what I said. We need questions. We don't need statements.
Okay, then my question would be, after visiting Senator Kerry's office and speaking with his aide, Mark Sternman, I asked why it was that you were not permitted to speak in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in August, and I asked if there was any sort of a justification given to you in terms of why you would not be able to make your case or to talk about what you've experienced in Iraq.
And he said?
He told me, well, first of all, he sort of dismissed it by beginning to say that you are like a quote-unquote controversial figure, which is what I've frequently have heard from various people. And then when I asked him to expand on that, he referred me to the Boston Phoenix, which he feels is one of the most liberal publications in Massachusetts, and that they've sort of painted you as being somewhat controversial. So then I read the articles in the Boston Phoenix.
Yeah,
okay,
we're going to have to get. We have a lot of people here who want to ask questions
sorry,
here.
That's it. That was my question. I'd like to know from you if there was explanation given to you by Joe Biden or other members of that committee as to why you would not be able to testify.
No.
Thank you. Next question. Sir.
I wonder if the panel couldn't address what I think is a greater probability, and that is that nuclear materials are possessed both by Iraq and by Al-Qaeda, and that they originated from the Russian mafia, and that neither inspection nor a war can turn up the small quantities of nuclear material that have such devastating effect if they're used as we fear.
Anyone want to touch that?
Well, I don't think that I've seen no public or leaked intelligence suggesting that there's been any leakage of materials from Russia to Al-Qaeda or to Iraq. I mean, we of course never know what we don't know. And we know there have been, say, somewhere between 6 and 10 interceptions of nuclear materials, weapons-grade nuclear materials coming out of Russia. So we know there's been some smuggling. We don't know how much of it we didn't catch. The 6 to 10 are ones that we caught. There's been no reports that Al-Qaeda or Iraq have gotten their hands on it. I'll just point out, though, that if that actually has happened, this would be a catastrophe beyond dreaming, because what it would mean is that there's been a general eruption from Russia of nuclear materials, and we should assume and expect that Al-Qaeda and Iraq aren't the only people who've gotten their hands on them. Furthermore, we should realize this is a disaster, should it happen, that we can't reverse, because these materials will be out there, they last forever, and you've just described a total nightmare, a real nightmare, should it happen. And this is why I am so appalled and upset that our government has not treated the situation in Russia as an emergency.
Sure. You there?
My question is to Mr. Ritter. I seem to recall that before the inspectors were withdrawn from Iraq the last time, there was constant criticism that they did not get access when they wanted it to the location they wanted. And number one, can you confirm that this is so? And my next question is, what do you or does the United Nations think what will change if we again put inspectors into Iraq? Will they get horsed around the same way?
Okay, let me answer it in this way. The only way inspections will ever work, and it goes beyond the technical capabilities of the inspectors. I mean, I reject the concept that we would never be able to find anything. I think people should start respecting the professionalism of inspectors and the quality of the technical capabilities they bring to bear on the problem, to understand that when inspectors do go into Iraq, it's a heck of a lot like a crime scene investigator going after after a criminal scene. They can collect a lot of data that will point to the fact that Iraq or whatever the target is did something bad. But irrespective, it doesn't work unless two things take place. One, Iraq fully cooperates with the weapons inspection process. We can never again allow the situation to occur where Iraq got away with cat and mouse, hide and seek. Unfettered inspections mean unfettered inspections. So when the inspectors show up at a facility designated for inspection, Iraq must facilitate the immediate, unrestricted, unhindered access of the inspectors and allow them to do their job. Inspections cannot work unless this happens, and we should not try to make inspectors work unless Iraq is willing to do that. So if inspectors show up on the next round, if these rounds do take place, and Iraq obstructs, hinders, otherwise fails to comply, it's all over. The inspector should be withdrawn, and the issue should be referred to the Security Council. There is no second chance. But that's just one half of the equation, because there's another half of the equation. This is called maintaining the integrity of the process of investigation. Why are inspectors in Iraq? To go after disarmament in accordance with Security Council resolutions. Why are inspectors not in Iraq? To remove Saddam Hussein. And the problem that we have is that the United States, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, a nation that voted for Security Council resolutions calling for the disarmament of Iraq, has as its primary policy objectives in regards to Iraq the elimination of Saddam Hussein. This pollutes the process of the investigation. We cannot overlook the unfortunate reality that the last time inspectors were in Iraq seeking to gain unfettered access, they were used by the intelligence services of the United States to gather information that pertained to the security of Saddam Hussein. You cannot overlook this fact. So if inspectors go back in, not only must Iraq provide unhindered access, the United States is going to have to give the international community some sort of assurance that these inspectors will be allowed to do their job unhindered by the United States, that the United States will not put its policy objective of regime removal ahead of the international community's objective of disarmament. And that's impossible to do as long as the United States maintains a policy of regime removal. For inspections to work, frankly speaking, the United States is going to have to back off of its policy of regime removal. And the President could give a good faith assurance of this by urging Congress to repeal the Iraqi Liberation Act.
Sure.
Question for Mr. Ritter. I think you might have answered the second one, was about CIA spies being among the inspection team in Iraq, collecting information and also leaving devices there. I don't know quite what the devices were, but I heard that that was the case. The first question that I had, maybe you can address this, was the reason for leaving, the inspection team for leaving Iraq. Sometimes you hear that Saddam Hussein forced them out, and other times you hear that the United Nations withdrew them before the war. I'd like to get your read on that.
I think Richard Butler in his book, The Greatest Threat, speaks clearly on page 210 on what the circumstances were. He received a telephone call from Peter Burley, the Deputy American Ambassador to the U.S. Mission to the United Nations, instructing him to remove the inspectors. Richard Butler failed to report this instruction to the Security Council, to whom he was responsible to, instead acted on this instruction and withdrew the inspectors, opening the door for an American bombing campaign against Iraq. That's what happened. Saddam Hussein did not kick the inspectors out. Now, after we bombed Iraq using intelligence information gathered by the weapons inspectors, Iraq said the inspectors aren't welcome back in, and that's why we face this problem. But it's not because Saddam Hussein kicked them out.
Sir.
Mr. Ritter, I heard you speak at MIT a few weeks ago, and you and your fellow panelists both seemed to imply that neoconservatives in government and in the press are playing a negative role, both in regards to Iraq and in regards to larger U.S. foreign policy. Could you elaborate on that a bit, please?
Maybe someone on the panel can help me out here. I mean, I'll be more than happy to elaborate. I don't want to dominate the whole side. I'll just say that all you have to take a look at is who's advising President Bush. How would you characterize Paul Wolfowitz? Liberal, conservative, neoconservative. How would you characterize Donald Rumsfeld? How would you characterize Dick Cheney? How would you characterize any number of people other than Colin Powell? And these are people who are the senior most advisors, providing the advice on issues pertaining to national security. So that's what I mean by neoconservative influence on the issue. Now, the president said when he ran for office that he would be a uniter, not a divider, that he would reach across party lines. I see very little of that reflected in the nature of his cabinet.
Mickey, is this ideological? If Al Gore was president...
Oh, no, if Al Gore was president, I'm sure he would be asking Dick Cheney and Wolfowitz and all what he ought to do. No. I mean, you know, what can I say?
No, honestly, do you? I mean, it's a legitimate point. Is this ideological?
It's a legitimate point that presidents surround themselves, for the most part, with people whose advice they trust, whose judgment they trust. Those would tend to be people who share basic outlooks with them. Kennedy did it. Johnson did it. Clinton did it. They all do it. And you don't have... well, I don't know. I mean, I was elected actually with Al Gore at the same time, my guess is he would have asked me about environmental policy, but I don't know. I don't know how to respond to that.
Sir.
It's generally accepted that Saddam Hussein does not have any means, any long-range missiles or any other means of delivering an atomic attack on the United States. So if he develops a weapon of an atomic weapon of any kind, his next most logical target would be Israel. And it's generally accepted that Israel has atomic weapons of their own. They never admit it, and Ravi probably would never say that, but I have a large family in Israel which, in more or less specific language, have assured me that Israel has its own atomic weapons. And nobody has mentioned the possibility of mutual destruction. Now, Saddam may be a tyrant, but he's not suicidal. And if he should launch an attack on Israel using atomic weapons, I have been assured that Israel would vaporize that country with the weapons of its own. So what is the purpose of this war?
What about it, Raviv? Do you think that would happen?
First of all, I'm only a journalist, so I can say that Israel has nuclear bombs. Everybody knows it. According to all kinds of reports, Israel has at least 200 atomic bombs and ability to submarines, atomic submarines that can at least reduce the danger of eliminate Israel without being retaliated. So the worst case scenario, you're probably right. I mean, if Saddam Hussein will launch missiles with chemical or biological ability against Israel, and Israel, as you all know, is very, very small, It's enough that you will hit Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. You can hit thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people. So Israel could face a situation that it would want to retaliate with a nuclear bomb, and then God knows what will happen. But from my perspective, from my point of view, from what I'm hearing from the Israeli government, from the Israeli Prime Minister office, or something like this, the probability is that something like this will happen is quite small. First, because we doubt the fact that he has this ability, that he will do it, and they have this, I don't know how to call it, but they at least have this notion that they could with this Chetz anti-missiles system that now Israel has, and it didn't have this during the Gulf War, maybe to hit those missiles before they hit Israel.
Young man.
My question is an open question to anybody.
Come to the mic a little closer.
My question is an open question. Last Sunday, it was either Arthur Schlesinger or Ted Sorensen who said that if George W. Bush was the president in 1962, we wouldn't be here having this discussion. I was wondering if you would agree, yes or no.
Gillian, you know that Sorensen guy, don't you?
Well, I have I can't say on that particular point, but I've always felt that one of the most important things a president has to know is not every detail of the situation, but what questions to ask. And my concern with our president today is that his knowledge of that region is zero. I dare say he could not have found Afghanistan on a map before this year. And he has some very, very smart, strong-willed, persuasive advisors around him who are telling him what to think and what to do. And he isn't in a position to question or raise doubts, as President Kennedy did in 1962. I think it's a very dangerous situation that we're in that way.
I'll add a comment on that, which is I basically, I don't know if the answer is we wouldn't be here, but I think we do now know there was a serious division in the government, and there were advocates of an attack on Cuba instead of a blockade. Most of the people in the White House actually favored a surprise attack on Cuba as the answer in 1962, and the president, in the end, he was the most dovish person in the group, and he decided not to do it. We now know that if we'd launched an attack, it would have turned out far worse than we thought at the time. We were not aware that there were already Soviet warheads in Cuba. We were not aware that the local Soviet commanders had authority to use them. It seems likely that if we'd launched an invasion, we would have, in fact, been nuked with short-range theater nuclear weapons. The Soviets also had a lot more troops in Cuba than we thought, so we would have faced a kind of Vietnam scenario once we got in there. That does show the risk of war, that there's a great deal of fog in this world, and when you launch war, the outcome is often hard to discern. And I do think that Americans should all think carefully about this war with Iraq. Are there downside risks that we are not fully prepared to deal with, that we're sure are not going to happen? To me, the most worrisome and frightening of these is that Saddam is going to unleash weapons of mass destruction in this country during the coming war. He does have biological and chemical weapons. We don't know the full picture on what he's got. For example, we don't know if he has smallpox, but we know he has anthrax and he has botulinum toxin and ricin and other things. We also know that we have, I think, immensely foolishly left our borders wide open for more or less anyone to come and go. Only 2% of the containers that go in and out of Boston Harbor are inspected. You could put anything you want on them. And are we prepared for a real downside scenario where he tries to strike this country? Now, I think that scenario is unlikely for rather peculiar reasons. I think Saddam is so arrogant and lives in such a separate universe from the rest of us that I think he's going to approach this war with great arrogance and confidence. And he's not going to think he faces doomsday, so he's not going to prepare doomsday. But if I also think the history of his efforts to do terrorism show that his terror guys are incompetent. So I'm trusting his kind of la-la land expectations about the war and the incompetence of his people, that he's not going to unleash what he could unleash in this country. But the fact remains that he could, in the abstract. Everyone in this country should realize there is a risk, that our homeland is at risk in this war.
Let me just say why I just need to step in here. When I hear people say we know he has biological weapons and we know he has chemical weapons, we don't know that. We suspect that. But as a weapons inspector, I can tell you, having spent 7 years in Iraq going after these weapons capability, in 1998, you will not find a single United Nations document that says we know they have this capability. You'll find a lot of documents that say we have significantly disarmed and reduced these capabilities. There are things unaccounted for, and therefore we have concern. But we have to be careful about giving them a capability that we can't back up with substantive fact. I would say I would share any assessment that says Iraq has the capability to produce chemical weapons and biological weapons. And without inspectors, we should be very concerned about that capability. But whenever I hear someone say, we know they have weapons, that's a violation of Security Council resolution right there. And if we have that knowledge, I think we would share that with the Security Council, and the Council would be considering, serious action, not the return of inspectors, but serious action such as war, because that is a material breach. We can't say they're in material breach because we don't know what they have. That's why we need to get inspectors back in.
Sure.
One of the things that 9/11 brought about is starting Americans to really think about the world. And gradually and reluctantly, an increasing number of alert Americans have come to realize we're hated in many areas of the world by many types of people for many different reasons. And now, the Middle East, of course, being a seedbed of some of the worst radicalism, anti-Americanism, and terrorism in the world. What about our going in there boldly and looking to beyond a war, which we'll say succeeds? Looking to the day after that, what about the proliferation of terrorists? And this, it frightens me to go on with this, but could somebody react to that?
You want to touch that, Mickey?
Well, I mean, whenever there's a war, there are consequences that are bad, and that's very a real possibility. Sure, that there are people who dislike us for a lot of reasons. Some are valid, and some are not valid. But I have no question that World War I led to World War II. I would love to discount what he said, but I mean, you can't really discount it. It could happen.
What about Raviv, though, in terms of, even from an Israeli point of view, does Israel hitting back hard against Palestinians, does it create more terrorists than it takes out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that from Sharon's point of view, this war creates, I think I said it, a lot of opportunities, and even during the war, you might do things against the Palestinians, like removing Arafat or something like this, because all the world would focus with something else, with Iraq or something like this. And I think that basically, concerning the United States and President Bush, the day he entered his office, before 9/11, he thought something like, well, forget the Middle East. Clinton was engaged too much with it. It's not so important. I will focus with other things. And I hope that now he understands that the Middle East is such a time bomb all the time, that even if we go after Iraq, it will not end afterwards. I mean, the United States will have to be all the time engaged in the Middle East, have to be engaged in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, his speech from the 24th of June, like saying, well, we wait until Arafat will go, until the Palestinian people will elect another leadership. The consequence is that Sharon can do whatever he wants, can occupy all the territories back, and nobody will do anything against him because Bush is saying, well, it's okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'd like to identify myself as an American Jew, just to preface some of this. And then what I'd like to question is come back to the politics behind this. It was alluded to early, and then it got moved off right away. It's too difficult to talk about that. Why now? Why did it come up? Why in August of this year has this become the issue to talk about? And specifically for you, Ravi, I think what you've said now is a little bit different than what you said in the beginning. What you first said was that you hoped that the U.S. would carry out this war now, because if not, Israel might have to do that 4 or 5 years down the road. And that, I thought that was deflecting from what might happen in the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And I think it's really important to recognize that this Iraq war changes also the relationships for what has to happen in Israel-Palestine. That if we are involved in the war in Iraq, yes, Arafat might be removed, all these things might happen, without, in fact, the world watching what happens in Israel-Palestine. And I think it's really, so I think for political reasons, both in this country and for what's happening in Israel-Palestine, it might be political reasons why Israel is supporting the U.S. going into Iraq. I think it's a very mistaken notion. I think it's to ascribe that Saddam is paying off the family of...
Question.
Okay, I will leave it there. So my question is, do you not see it as a political move in the interest of the State of Israel, which may or may not be leading towards a true peace for Palestinians as well as Israelis?
I would like just to make clear my opinion about the permanent solution between Israel and Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, is very, very different from the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister thinks that if the United States will remove Saddam Hussein, and Iraq will become much, much weaker, then it will create opportunity because Syria will become weaker, maybe the Hezbollah, maybe Iran. Everybody will know who is the superpower in the world, all the Arab regimes, and then Arafat and the Palestinian will become maybe more moderate. He could maybe force his solution on the area. I don't think like he does, but from his point of view, you can see that 3 days ago, there was an attack on Israel, suicide bomber in Karkur Junction, 14 people died. Sharon didn't retaliate. He did nothing. Why? Because he wants the Americans to attack Iraq now and he doesn't want to interfere. It's simple as that.
Sure.
Mr. Edwards, you're the only politician or somebody that served in office up here, and you're a Republican. There's no Democrat for me to pick on for this question. As so you may have to you may have to pretend like you are one. Here's my point. As I listen to this discussion tonight and listen to the reaction of the audience and other panels that I've heard before, there seems to be at least, let's say, half of the country, if not more so, that are opposed to this war. Why are the Democratic leaders and maybe other leaders not speaking out more aggressively against this action?
You've seen polls I haven't seen. Most of the polls indicate that the majority of the American people are supportive of the Bush administration's position. You can go back and read them. You may not like what they say in Missouri and Kansas and other places, but that is the majority view. I suppose I had a vested interest as a Republican in thinking bad things about the Democrats and thinking they were just all political advantage seekers. I don't believe in that, just as I don't believe in characterizing people who disagree with you as dummies who can't find Afghanistan on a map. I mean, that's just, I am so sick of hearing that kind of nonsense. But the fact of the matter is, that I believe, I hope I'm right, I believe that the members of the Democratic Party who have said that military action is justified, and there are many who don't agree with that. And they have spoken out. Al Gore has spoken out. John Edwards has spoken out. Others have spoken out. But I believe that those who have said it is justified actually believe in their hearts and their minds that's the right thing. I don't believe that people like Gephardt and others, whether you agree with them or not, are people who are going to send Americans over to be killed for political advantage. I just don't believe that that's the case. So why are they not speaking out? Some have spoken out. As I said, Al Gore gave a very courageous speech on that. I didn't agree with it, but he gave a very courageous speech. I think those who are going along with the president believe, sometimes reluctantly, that that's what has to be done.
So we got about 15 minutes left, so I want to get all these questions in. So if you can ask them quick, go away.
I'm trying to think of my question, but I'd just like to prompt other people to come up to ask questions. There's 15 minutes left that are reluctant to do so. I listened pretty carefully to some television talk about. I'm not well read in any of this, but I was listening to both sides, and as I listen to different people speak, I get pulled over to their side, okay? Because I can't make a final decision. But some of the things that concerned me was there's no talk. I've heard people say, what about the oil? The United States wants to go there to get the oil. Things like that. I don't know if people are well read that said that, if it's just opinion they heard. It certainly is in my mind, it would be a powerful reason to go there just to get the oil. Some people are saying, well, it's a political move. You have a debate with that, Mr. Edwards. Mr. Van Avera, you scare me when you talk because you make it sound like we're in this huge pickle with all these other countries that have these arsenals. They're very scary. And I saw something on television the other night about how all that stuff is open in Russia.
Okay. So can we just have a question? You're saying is this for oil?
Okay. The question is this. I've lots of questions, but I'll get to this one. What is anybody's feeling about the suggestion that the United States, one of the powerful reasons we're going there is to have control of the oil, or to get the oil?
What about it? Does anybody believe it's about oil? Get oil?
No, I would add, I don't believe it's about oil, but I think if it were, that's certainly not a justification for going to war.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
How about implementation of a policy of unilateralism? Anybody thought about that? You know, we talk a lot about the threat that Iraq poses. We talk about the need to go to war for the security of the United States. Why don't people reflect on what might really be at stake here? I mean, that's sort of the bottom line of your question. What's really going on here? Anybody read the National Security Strategy document put forward by the Bush administration last month? Anybody understand what the policy of preemption is? Does anybody understand what American unilateralism is? Does anybody might reflect that maybe Iraq has been picked by the Bush administration, that we're running head-on into war because it's a soft target and a window of opportunity so we can implement unilateralism and what that means, imperialism and all that comes along with it? That might play a factor in all of this too.
Sir.
I was struck by Gillian's use of a term that actually was chilling, and that is that Americans' actions grate on those others on the world stage. I live in Paris, and I've lived in Paris for the last 6 years. I come back to America every 6 or 8 weeks. In the last 6 weeks, I've been in London, Berlin, and Prague, as well as Paris. I've yet to meet one person in my travels there who suggests that this is a very good move on the part of America. I have two questions. One, I'm struck by the lack of public dialogue and questioning about America's role on the world stage, particularly in light of us unilaterally going ahead and for the first time in our history, preemptively going in and deciding that a head of state should be removed. And where does that lead us? And secondly, whatever you think about France, let me tell you that the World Health Organization ranks it as #1 in the world in the delivery of medical services. #1 out of 130 countries. I'm struck, and here's my question. How can a country, the richest in the world, that has 42 million people without medical insurance, contemplate a $200 billion war?
Anybody want to tackle that? I think that's a rhetorical question. But,
well, why is there no dialogue prior to going to Baghdad as to our role in the world?
Right. Go ahead.
It will certainly, as you suggest, be a very costly war. And and it's not correct to say that we won't notice the difference or that we can afford it. It'll be costly in a great many ways and not just dollars and cents. But one of those is in our reputation as a world leader, as a sovereign leader who has respect for other nations as well, who works with other nations. There is a huge difference between our going into this alone and our going into it in an international coalition. That has a legitimacy that is very different, and that requires bringing along France and the others into that coalition. If we go alone, then we are Exhibit A of the imperialist America. We will be demonized around the world. We will generate another 10,000 suicide bombers. by that. We simply cannot do that alone. I think that that will be disastrous for the U.S. in the long run. If we have to go to war, then we need to be making every possible effort between now and then to build that international coalition and to bring other countries into it with us. But you are quite correct. The costs will be considerable no matter how it's done, and somebody's going to pay for that.
Okay, ma'am, 10 minutes left. Let's keep these questions flying. Quick.
Right. We seem to have such a hawk's eye view on Saddam and rarely get a chance to look at Iraq as a nation of 22 million people. And just recently, at the time of the election, the Globe did an extremely interesting article on people that they could speak to and that a reporter could speak to in Baghdad, including a doctor who said that they have many, many problems in Iraq, and that but they're not problems that can be better solved by the U.S. than by Iraqi people. And I guess I don't know who to ask this question to, but is there anyone on the panel who thinks that we really understand and can do a better job of solving those problems in Iraq and making Iraq a more stable place than some Iraqis?
Who wants it?
Well, I would. No, I think Iraqis better understand their situation than we do. Unfortunately, they don't have meaningful elections. They don't have a free press. So it's not as though we're like in the United States. Well, why don't the Iraqis simply vote him out of office? I mean, it doesn't work that way. And so I think the reality of the situation is we're not dealing with a democracy in which expression by the public can bring about the changes that might take place in the United States or other democracies.
Ma'am.
In light of the announcement by North Korea and the present meeting going on down in Texas, is there anybody on the panel who would like to give me their opinion? Is the thrust of the government about to change? I perceive a greater danger from North Korea than I do from Iraq.
What about it, Scott? Do you buy it?
Well, no. Look, the Bush administration has made it clear on a couple fronts. A, accepts the concept of diplomatic engagement to resolve the situation with North Korea, even though we have a declared nuclear power that rejects inspections, and that we will go to war against Iraq, even though we have a power that has not been found to have nuclear weapons, is willing to accept inspections. This isn't about the national security of the United States in terms of a real threat. This is about implementation of a national security strategy that reflects a political ideology of unilateralism, and Iraq is the easy target. We're going to war against Iraq because it's there. Congress gave the president the green light. The United Nations is going to give the president the green light no matter what it does, because either it's going to reject this American-sponsored resolution, or the resolution will go in. The United States, because it has a policy of regime removal, will manipulate the inspections to create a provocation for a strike that will take advantage of a window that opens at the end of December and closes in March. Don't bring North Korea in. That complicates the issue with facts. We're going to war against Iraq because the administration has already made its decision. We're going to war against Iraq.
Yes, sir. Ma'am, we got to get other people. I'm sorry.
Professor Van Averen, 5 or 6 years ago, there were numerous reports that a few dozen Soviet suitcase weapons, nuclear weapons, were missing. And then these reports were refuted, and then it sort of dropped out of the news. Do you know anything about this?
I think U.S. intelligence decided in the end that those warnings were false, and that the suitcase weapon warning, which was that a number of finished bombs, tactical nuclear bombs, could not be accounted for in the Russian tactical nuclear inventory, that those reports were wrong. They were believed for quite a while by some folks in government, and in fact, a year ago, if you remember when Dick Cheney began going to his undisclosed location, the reason was the fear, and there was some reports that one of those bombs had come to the U.S., and that was what the reaction was to. But I think that as the evidence has sorted itself out over the last many months, people have decided that there was an accounting mistake, and those weapons aren't loose. But people, fine, we dodged that bullet. Let's remember there's several tens of thousands of weapons worth of other materials and bombs that are very poorly secured over there and wide open for sale or theft, and we better get on it.
Yes, sir.
May I ask each member of this distinguished, thoughtful panel to give a simple answer to a simple question. Imagining that you were a strong, angry, dangerous person facing a much stronger, also angry and dangerous person, would you strike that other person before or after he struck you?
Anybody want to touch
Before
that?
or after, each one?
After, because there's no way my strike would result in knocking that stronger person out, so I would hope that I would be able to come up with a situation that would avoid that strike. And you see, I'm not going to be able, if I'm Iraq, I'm not going to deliver a knockout blow to the United States, no matter what I do. And if I do strike the United States, I die. So I don't buy into the concept that Iraq's going to strike us first. Iraq's going to do everything possible. Saddam Hussein's going to do everything possible to stay alive. And he's going to hope that the United Nations can come up with a solution before the United States goes to war.
Right. Yes, sir. Yeah. We got to get other people questions in. I want to get these last two in.
Stephen earlier mentioned that Saudi Arabia has been a source of a lot of trouble. So, but we have to deal with Al Qaeda right now. Do you think we have a plan for Saudi Arabia right now, or will we ever have a plan for Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think there are people in Washington who want to put them on the hit list, you know. The expansive view in Washington is that Iraq is the first one. And then we're going to go after the folks who support Hezbollah, and that means Syria and Iran. And that how we're going to do it, that hasn't been fully explained. Probably not, you know, a huge war, but limited use of force. And then there's a view that, you know, moving down the hit list, you get to Saudi Arabia, and that we ought to pursue regime change there. My view is that that's the wrong way to proceed, that the Saudis are people with whom we have lots of other ways to skin that cat. The Saudi elite want to remain our friends. Their concept is that, you know, they're part of our world. They want to trade with us. They don't like us, cultural differences, but they want to be part of the West. And if we ever put our trade relations and our military relations on the table with them, we may, I hope, get a very different attitude out of them, especially on this matter of the export of Wahhabism.
Last two questions. You, sir.
Yes. This is Scott Ritter. If the two conditions that you mentioned before for inspectors going in are met, could you give us a fast assessment of how effective they are likely to be?
In terms of giving the world assurances that they can account for 100% of anything Iraq might have hypothetically been able to do in the field of weapons of mass destruction? No. They'll be able to give us a pretty good assessment. In terms of putting in a monitoring regime of inspections that ensures Iraq cannot reconstitute the means to produce weapons of mass destruction in any meaningful scale, 100%. And that's a pretty darn good ratio in my book.
Sir, it falls to you to ask the final question. I hope it's a humdinger.
I hope so. Everybody agrees that Saddam is a nasty person. He gassed his own people, the Kurds. He gave assurances to his son-in-laws that they would be safe if they came back, and they promptly killed them. The first Bush didn't know what to do with Saddam as far as the end of the Gulf War, and he didn't want the Shiites to come to power because that would be aiding the Iranians. He didn't want the Kurds to come to power because
and the question is...
Yes. What do you see as the outcome of this regime change? We haven't heard anything about what's going to be there, what's going to be the government there, and what it's going to cost, and how long is it going to take?
That's a great question. I think that the occupation of Iraq is going to be actually more difficult than the defeat of Saddam. I'm expecting the war to go quite well. Then what happens? And I think recent history should warn us that once we conquer countries with the aim of settling things down and reconstructing them, we're very bad at getting out. We're still in Korea 50 years later. We're still in Bosnia 7 years after we said we'd be leaving. And I'm expecting a long and difficult occupation. It's going to cost us a lot of money. The reason it will be difficult is that Iraq is a very divided country internally. And I fear we're going to find ourselves in a situation where if we do pull out, the country will fall apart. The Kurds will secede. You'll have a civil war. And the only answer we're going to find out in the end is that some strong force is going to have to sit on that country. It takes a guy like Saddam to keep a country like Iraq together. That's the problem. And once we take on this tar baby, I have a hard time seeing how we're going to let go of it.
Does anybody else want to take a crack at that, Mickey?
Well, I just want to make an observation. I mean, it's easy to lose sight of the issue. And the issue is if the threat is real, that's an if. If the threat is real to the safety of the American people, then one bases the decision on what must be done to protect the American people. In World War II, where it was not preemptive, but in response, we did not say, well, we're not going to fight because it's going to cost us money, and then we won't have enough for health care. And we didn't say we're not going to fight because how will we rebuild Japan? We'll have to be there for many years. Those are peripheral and secondary and ultimately trivial issues compared to the one, which is the significant issue. Is there a threat to the security of the American people? If there is, then you have to do something about it. If it's not proven that there is a threat, then you shouldn't do something about it. And that's the real issue on the table.
Well, folks, thanks for coming out. Let's thank the panel and yourselves for some great questions.
I want to take this opportunity to thank our wonderful panel and to say that in the spirit of President Kennedy's relentless quest for ways of averting war in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis 40 years ago, I think you've been treated to a relentless quest by a very diverse panel of views who, if I may hazard the assumption, all would nonetheless like to find ways of averting war. I'm particularly grateful to our wonderful moderator, Kevin Cullen, who has kept everything going. And I want to thank each of our panelists, Raviv Drucker, Mickey Edwards, Gillian Sorensen, Scott Ritter, and Stephen Von Evera. Thank you.